This demonstrates watercolor painting using wet and sticky. The main thing to notice about watercolor is that the paint moves and evolves over time. The model has a notion of wetness and of gravity, and over time the paint moves under the influence of gravity. Gravity can be switched off if you do not want gravity, but it moves under the influence of gravity and it disperses, so it mixes with other paints. As you can see, the initial stroke is a dry mark, but then as soon as you lift off, the paint starts to move, and it does so over a period of time, and all the while drying out slightly, so that once the paint is completely dry, it will not move anymore. You have the option to dry the whole canvas as well. You have the option to put on just pure water as well, and you can change the opacity of the strokes. There is a simplistic texture model going on here as well, where we try to replicate some of the effects of using textured paper. This model has been improved, so these are simple clumping algorithms being used at the moment, and they're much more advanced in the later versions. You can have completely dry paint as well, and when you use that you get more of an ink-like effect, and we envisage in the final application having an ink setting, which is basically a dry watercolor. And you have different styles of brushes, different sizes of brushes. We now have brushes which allow you to be chiseled, as in the oil paints, to give you a sharp edge, so you can lead up to an area and get a crisp edge at the top or the bottom of the stroke. This is a demonstration of chalk. One of the general properties of all the models is that you can select the substrate, you can select the surface. We have surfaces that look like cartridge paper, that look like canvas, that look like watercolor paper, and you can make them any color you like. So here we've got colored paper texture, and we're using chalks to make marks on it. The chalks have various parameters. They have roughness, which defines how rough the marks are. They have pressure, they have the standard ones of the size of the piece of chalk, and the edging technique we have for giving sharp lines. You can also blur them, as we've just done there, and we still have the same model that we have in both oil and watercolor, where we can load a certain amount onto the chalk. So you can have an unlimited supply, or it can run out. The advantage of that is that you can get sort of gradated shading techniques. There's some strokes coming on in a minute, we'll show you that. And you can change the opacity. So this next stroke, I believe, demonstrates that the chalk is running out, and you get this feathering and shading, which is a very nice feature. Chalks work by depositing chalk on the crests of the texture of the paper. And if the first stroke will deposit on the crest, and if you go backwards and forwards, you'll actually fill in the valleys as well and get a solid texture. Again, you can have thin lines which are just like pencils, and it gives a very convincing pastel effect. This is a short demonstration of the oil painting capabilities of wet and sticky. In this we'll show you the ability to mix paints, to load the brush with different colors, to have different brush sizes, and primarily show how paints are mixed in the canvas, and they can obviously be mixed on a mixing palette as well. So what's happened first of all is we've laid a base coat of an ochre, and then we put on a bit of darker grey to try and add a shadow under this apple that we're painting. And as you can see, the two colours at the bottom are mixed, and as we've painted in the apple, the strokes are also mixing with each other and with the wet paint underneath, particularly at the bottom edge of the apple. Started with a thick brush, now I'm using a smaller brush to try and add some definition and get the shape right. The brushes can be used in many ways. They have the capacity to change in size and change in profile, so we can have a sharp edge or a blunt edge or a round brush. We can also, using this approach, we can get very fine lines from a limited set of brushes. Brushes have various other controls. One is that when you load it with paint, you can decide how much mixing will go on between the paint on the brush and the paint underneath. In oil paint you can decide how much of an impasto effect you should get, which changes the visible marks left by the bristles and the depth of the paint. You can also change whether the paint on the brush inherits the new color that it's mixed underneath the stroke. That is to say, when you first pick up some paint from the palette, you pick up a pure color. So in this case here, picked up a pure green, and there's a pure black. Now as you see the strokes being painted, it's picking up some of the background color. Now it's possible to have it set so that the next stroke you do uses the colors that you've picked up as the basis, or you can have it that it reverts back to the color that was on the palette, which is what I'm actually doing here. What else can you do with the brushes? You can change the amount of paint on the brush. You can load a brush so it has a never-ending supply of paint, which is sort of the standard way brushes work in most paint packages, or you can load it with a set amount of paint which runs out over time. The advantage of that is that you can get a nice effect at the end of strokes as the paint runs out. What else? You can fix everything on the canvas. So in this case, if I wanted not to get the mixing going on at the edge of the apple with the blue background, I could have just dried all the paint, and then any subsequent strokes would just be on top of a dried static image and would not mix. But as you build up the strokes, you are building up a new wet layer where paints mix. I think that the key thing here is you can create marks and effects and painterly effects, which obviously are not identical to oil paint, but are a closer approximation than anything on any mobile device at the moment. High-end paint packages have some of these capacities, but they tend to cost an awful lot of money, and there is nothing on the iPad at the moment which comes close to the complexity